We are looking at a picture of the planet Jupiter taken with the Hubble Space Telescope in 1994 at a time when the fragments of a shattered comet, Shoemaker-Levy 9, were pummeling into the planet, leaving huge black impact sites on the planet.
A bunch of them going in kind of like this.
Prior to Shoemaker-Levy 9, we had never had the opportunity to prepare to watch an interplanetary impact in our solar system.
Isn't that incredible? It's right in the methane. That's amazing. That's what we all said.
Shoemaker-Levy 9 was a comet that was discovered by Gene and Carolyn Shoemaker and David Levy.
Comet watcher and co-discoverer of the comet, and he's an astronomer at Lowell Observatory.
Which is why it's called Shoemaker-Levy 9. It was the 9th comet that team had found.
And to his left, his wife, Dr. Carolyn Shoemaker. To her left, David Levy, co-discoverer of the comet.
And what was unusual about Shoemaker-Levy 9 was that it was in orbit around Jupiter. We believe was captured probably about 70 years earlier, the late 1920s. It wasn't just flying through the solar system. It had at some point in the past been captured by the gravitational field of Jupiter. And more importantly than that, when the orbit of the comet was computed, it was discovered that within about 6 months, this comet was going to hit Jupiter. We think the reason that Shoemaker-Levy 9 was shattered into so many fragments was that on its last close pass while it was orbiting Jupiter, the gravitation was so strong, the gravity field, that it actually caused it to fragment and break up.
Joining me here on the podium or up front is Heidi Hamel from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
I was asked to take all of the proposals that had been accepted to look at Jupiter as the comet was hitting it and put them together into one large observing program with Hubble so that it could capture all the full range of what may happen on Jupiter. Everybody who predicted that we would see something dramatic was right. And the Hubble observations were fantastic. We saw massive explosions. We saw ripples in the atmosphere of Jupiter. We saw dark material that was processed by the intense heat of these explosions. This image of Jupiter taken by the Hubble Space Telescope was one of the most dramatic images from the Shoemaker-Levy 9 week. It was a week-long event. It took that long for all the fragments of this shattered comet to hit Jupiter. This particular image is of a particularly large fragment. It created a massive plume of material that shot out for thousands of miles above Jupiter's cloud tops. It took about 20 minutes to rise and then collapsed. And so the arc that we see in the bottom of this image is the collapsed material from this gigantic plume. It was just an amazing example of the power of collisions in our solar system.
Well, hello, everybody. It is a great pleasure to introduce one of my very, very best friends, David Levy, and he is with Kent Martz. They are at the 2024 Astronomical League Convention in Kansas City, David is one of the keynote speakers there. And this month, as was just explained in the NASA video that we just watched, is the 30th anniversary of comet Shoemaker-Levy 9 as it impacted Jupiter. And so, David, it's great to see you again, and I'm going to turn this over to you, Kent.
So, sorry, we can't hear you, Scott. There's a lot of people background noise.
Okay, I'm just turning it over to you.
Oh, okay, because we
Yeah.
let's send somebody down there trying to get them to be a little quieter.
Trying to get David's attention.
Yep.
Okay.
So David, he was saying that, it's the 30th anniversary of Shoemaker-Levy 9, and we were leaned over because the speakers are very quiet, so we're leaning over to looking and watching, and David whispered into my ear, "It's still exciting." And talk about that, David.
Just looking at those images of what that tiny little comet did to Jupiter is really something. And it sent a bone-chilling chill for me when I first saw those things, those dark spots. It was the first dark spot. And it sent a chill for me when I saw it just now, 30 years later. My lecture tonight is going to be nominally about Shoemaker-Levy 9 30 years later. But the real, excuse me, the real heart and soul of my lecture tonight is going to be the Linda Hall Library, which is the locale. When I was a little kid, I was a little boy, not that old, I was a teenager at the Jewish National Home for Asthmatic Children in Denver, where I was living for 14 months. And then I got active in the Denver Astronomical Society, which I am still active in all these years later. But while I was there, this man came up to me one day and asked me a simple question. He said, "How many books does it take to make a library?" And I had no idea what the answer was. And I started maybe 652 or something like that. And he said, no. And he looked at me and he said, "The answer is 2 books. You only need 1 book is a book. 2 books, it's a library. And it's a library as valuable as the Library of Congress, as valuable as the British Library. The British Library right now, I believe, is the largest library in the world. The Library of Congress is the 2nd largest library in the world. And the 2 books that I have with me today it's not the largest library in the world, but according to that definition, it's a library. And while I was working on my PhD dissertation, I heard about the Linda Hall Library, and I just wanted to go and get a sense of that institution. My God, did I get a sense of it. This is the library where Galileo's original material is stored. They have Rheticus, they have Copernicus, and they have a lot of other people. And then way down on the list, they have David, me. They have all of my observing logs. They have all of my personal journals. They have all of a lot of the other things I've done. But probably most important of all, that library has my first telescope, Echo. I got that telescope as a bar mitzvah present from my uncle in September of 1960. And I've used it almost every night until I finally decided to donate it to the Linda Hall Library a number of years ago. It was kind of difficult for me to give that telescope up. But once that started, the idea of letting other institutions have telescopes that were once mine actually turned out to be a good one. In fact, Miranda, the telescope that I've used to find all but one of the visually discovered comets that I found, That telescope is now at the Telescope Museum of the Royal Astronomical Society of Canada. And it's a very important addition there because there are, I think it was 8 comets, 8 of the 9 visual comets that I found are from that library. Are found with that telescope. And so it's a part of me. To me, telescopes are breathing human things. They are people. Telescopes are people too, like you and me. And they are so special. They have personalities. And whenever I go out to the observatory, even now, whenever I go out to the observatory, I always talk to them, like Wesley Pelter did with his telescopes. He'd go in and tell them about his day, and I would tell my telescopes a bit about my day. And I always imagine after I go in for the night and I leave the telescopes by themselves, do they kind of have a little conversation amongst themselves about what that day was like and what exciting things happened and what earth or sky shattering things happened that day. It's hard to say. I'm still looking for comets. I'm still looking for things. And I'm still really enjoying the night. The thing about Shoemaker-Levy 9 that really gets to me is those impact spots. A lot of them were larger than the Earth itself. And they lasted. They were there. Jupiter then went kind of beyond the sun for a while. And then a few months later, it was up in the morning sky. And I went out and looked at it. And lo and behold, the impact spots were still there months later. They were a part of Jupiter, and they could actually be detected for years after that. I don't think they can still be detected today, but there's probably a little bit of the personality of that comet will always be a part of Jupiter. There's another personal thing about Jupiter that I wish to share with you. Long before Shoemaker-Levy 9, Jupiter was my favorite planet. The reason it is my favorite planet is that it is the first thing I looked at in a telescope. It was when I was given the Echo as a bar mitzvah present. I took it at that night. Mom and Dad were with me. And the only thing I could see in the sky that would identify were 2 bright stars in the southern sky between the trees. And I put that telescope toward the brighter one. And as soon as I looked through the eyepiece, and I thought, it's a fuzzy thing with a hole in the middle of it. And I thought, this telescope has to go back. There's something wrong with it. And I learned a lot of things about telescopes. And the first thing I learned was that you have to focus them. And, but I didn't know that. So I looked at the eyepiece, and I think my head kind of hit the eyepiece and pushed it in a little bit. And when it did that, I saw that the hole in the middle of that fuzzy light was a little bit smaller, and the fuzz around it was a little smaller. I thought, well, that's interesting. So then I started to move the eyepiece closer to the bottom of the focuser. And as I did that, the image got clearer and clearer. The dark spot in the middle disappeared. And then there was Jupiter with the bands on it and 4 of the original Galilean satellites. And Galileo himself would have felt no greater thrill than I did that night when I first discovered Jupiter. And I've never forgotten it. And that's why Jupiter is my favorite planet. It's almost as if in 1993, when I was guiding that exposure, the first of the two discovery photographs of SL9. And I looked through the eyepiece and there was this big bright glare. And I found this guide star that I was supposed to be guiding on, but it was a little hard to see because of the glare around it. And that glare was from Jupiter, which was so nearby. And I remember saying to Jean, I sure hope there isn't anything exciting in this picture because it's hard to see the guide star with Jupiter so close. Boy, was there something exciting on that picture.
So tell the story of the realization, the discovery that, whoa, wait a minute, there's something here. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, it was a couple of days later because we had some cloud. Carolyn was sitting with the microscope. I was working on one of my books, which is all I often did on cloudy days at the observatory. Anyway, keep scanning, I'm writing, and then she stops. She looks at me and she said, I don't know what I've got, but it looks like a squashed comet. And Gene was there. He was reading Time magazine, one of his favorite magazines. And he said, oh, I got to take a look at this. And so Carolyn got up and she sort of moved over towards where I was. And Gene looked through the stereo microscope. While he was doing that, I turned to Carolyn and I said, you are joking about this, aren't you? And Carolyn shook her head and she said, not this time, David. And then I looked towards Gene. And the look on his face of absolute shock and puzzlement. So I needed to take a look, and my first view of SL9 through the stereo microscope at the discovery images was something that is engraved in my own brain and always will be. It was a comet that wouldn't stop being a comet. There was a head here and a tail, and then another head and a tail, and 5 or 6 heads and tails going off. And then on either side, there was dust trails going off in both directions. It was absolutely beyond belief. In fact, Congress passed a law the day before that you can't have a comet that looks like that. And President Clinton signed it. And then I'm looking at this thing through the stereo microscope, and I couldn't believe it was real. And we then went ahead to try to bring it to the measuring engine, which they had at the 48-inch telescope. And we're measuring that in Gene Mueller, a lifelong friend who I'm still very, very friendly and close with, was just as surprised and fascinated as we were. And then I decided it was time that we needed confirmation. I got on the telephone and I called my friend Jim Scotty, who was working at Peak at the time, told him what we had, and he said, David, you remember when you kind of interrupted some work I was doing before? And she said, I didn't mind you interrupting, but my boss did. And we have to be really careful about this. And I said, well, let me be more careful. If and when you get a chance, could you take a look at that field? And he said he would try. And so after we did the measuring, I got back. And it's time to call Jim. And I called Jim. He picked up the phone. I said, Jim? He said,
Who's Jim?
Jim Scotty.
Jim Scotty, okay.
Jim Scotty.
Okay.
And I said, are you okay, Jim? And he says, oh, yeah. He said, David, the sound I heard, the sound you just heard is me trying to pick my jaw off the floor. He said, him, do we have a comet? He says, holy cow, do you guys ever have a comet? We had music playing in the background at that time. And I always brought a collection of musical tapes, usually classical music that we could play. And the music that was going on in the background at the time was Beethoven's First Symphony, that really triumphant final movement. And as soon as he said, boy, do you guys ever have a comet? And the music was playing and it got louder and it was exciting. The whole thing, almost as if Beethoven were there playing it himself. It was so exciting. And I said, Jim, I don't know how to thank you for confirming this to us. And he said, David, you're not listening. He said, David, I am going to spend the rest of the night on your comet. I'm going to probably spend the rest of this observing period on your comet. I'm stopping everything else. I'm concentrating on this, the most unusual thing I've ever seen for a telescope.
Wow.
And even now, I don't think I've seen anything stranger than that to a telescope.
So his boss was not mad at him for looking at it.
Not for that.
Not that
Not
time.
not for doing the confirming image of comet. It was announced the next day, and before we got the announcement, she got a little bit worried because we had competition on that same telescope. Another group using the telescope, and they were actually doing the same type of work we were, and probably taking much of the same pictures that we were. And so we checked the log, and it turned out they had the same field that we had. And the announcement came out, and that other group was not included in it. I couldn't believe they weren't included on it. They couldn't believe they weren't included on it. And they tried to get included on it after the fact.
But they didn't say anything.
But they did after the fact.
That
But that was too late.
the rules are the rules.
The rules are the rules. And I think never was dear Brian Marsden closer to bending the rules than he was with the credit on that comet. But he actually told me later that he was thinking of taking my name off of it and putting theirs onto it. And I just looked at him without saying anything. And he said, oh, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm thinking about doing it, but I can't do it because you got it fair and square.
So what was the media circus like? What
Well-
was it what we can imagine, or was it not that bad?
Not that bad. It was worse than you can imagine. That comet was discovered, the most unusual comet we had ever discovered by far. And it even made it to page 56 of section E of the New York Times, a little article about this strange comet. And they got most of the story right, except they had me married to Carolyn Shoemaker, which was all right, but those were in the days before Wendy. Wendy and I had met each other, but we weren't a couple yet.
Mhm.
And but then shortly, about 2 months later, Brian sent me a letter in which he said, we are going to be publishing some really extraordinary news regarding your comet. He said, David, I can't tell you what it is now, but you're going to love it.
Cool.
And
That was tough, wasn't it? For how long did you have to wait for that
the
news?
days, it was just before I went up to Palomar, and it was the 22nd of May, it was my birthday. And we were sitting there, and I said, Brian, I saw Brian's letter that day, and I said, and the circular had, first time on the circular, Thomas Shoemaker will be mine. And I said, Carolyn, there's something going on with our comet. And of course, she dropped what she was doing. And they said, they said that the preliminary orbits that we have no longer allow for a parabolic solution. The comet is physically very close to Jupiter, so it has to be given, it's in orbit around Jupiter, but it's also, since Jupiter's in orbit around the sun, it is a periodic comet. And that's where the name was changed that day to Shoemaker-Levy 9. It was the 9th periodic comet we found as a team. And I think the record before that was 4 after that. So we had beaten them by 5 by that. Anyway, Shoemaker-Levy 9 was announced, but that wasn't it. He then published a list of the ephemeris of the comet where it was going to go. And one of the things he has is a Greek letter delta, which is the distance, was typically the distance between the comet and the Earth. But in this case, he wanted it to be the distance between the comet and the center of Jupiter.
Because it was orbiting Jupiter.
Because it was orbiting Jupiter. And we were both looking at this delta J thing very carefully, noticing that that distance was getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And then I noticed, I said, Carolyn, that's less than a Jovian radius at the bottom there. There's going to be a collision. And there's also a second circular in which Brian said that, for those of you who didn't notice what I said on the first circular, there is a 60 to 65% shot that at least parts of the comet are going to collide with Jupiter in 14 months from now. And Carol and I just sort of stood there silently and looked at this thing. And Gene was loading film for the night's observing. And he started calling. He said, "What's going on?" And I said, "Gene, our comet is going to collide with Jupiter." And Gene yelled, he said, "Don't say another word." And you could hear him slamming drawers, getting film out of the what protected. And he opens the door, he comes rushing out, and he looks at he
didn't believe you.
Well, he believed me, but he sure wanted to see it.
He wanted to see it for himself.
He sat down and looked at my laptop, and he saw it. He looked at the delta J part, and he understood what that meant too. And he said, he almost cried. He said, "In my lifetime, we are going to see a comet collide with a planet. We've never seen that before. It's going to happen in my lifetime." And Gene was shaking with excitement with that. Oh, he sure believed me at that point.
Yeah, yeah. So 30 years later, reflect back on all that time.
30 years later, we learned an awful lot. I think one of the most exciting things was the effect that the impacts had on the magnetic field. The K impactor did something that caused a beautiful auroral display on the other side of Jupiter that could be recorded in the images that the Hubble was taking. And it was really spectacular to see that. The whole idea, things were really happening that were not really the way that they should have happened. For example, the denser and larger impact sites disappeared more rapidly than the smaller and shallower ones.
Which is counterintuitive.
It's counterintuitive. A lot of counterintuitive things happened with that particular comet at that particular collision.
You have how many comets to your name?
23.
23.
Yeah.
They
They all have my name on it except one. And one was found by the late Tom Glinos, may he rest in peace. And But he made a mistake. He reported it as an asteroid, not a comet, because he could not detect any cometary activity in it. And so I got the announcement, and I read it immediately. And according to the rules, if you make a mistake like that, or if you report it as one type of object, and it turns out to be a comet, another type of object, then if you didn't report it correctly, even though you may not have been wrong, you were right at the time you reported it, then you lose the chance to have your name put on it. Instead, the name of the comet is the name of our observatory. Our observatory is called
Jarnac.
Jarnac Observatory. So all of a sudden, it was 2010 F2 Jarnac. And I was just jumping on the desk with excitement. And I decided
So it didn't hurt your feelings any.
I decided I was gonna have some fun with Tom. And I called Tom and I said, Tom, boy, did you make a mistake here? This position's off, that position's off. And he says, what? And I said, Tom, I'm gonna get off the phone. I'd like you to look at this. I'm gonna send it to you now. Then call me back and we'll discuss it. And I sent him the circular and reported the announcement of Comet Jarnac. Phone rings and he goes, oh my God. That was something.
So times have changed in the world of comet hunting.
Oh, they have.
You know, you were having to process film and blink comparators and stereo microscopes,
Or doing it visually.
or like you still do. In fact, I was with you at the Arizona Dark Sky Star Party in what, 2019,
2019.
and we stayed up all night, and
And
you
I
were
was just loving it.
and you were scanning the sky, and you went, "Oh, what's that?" And I'm sitting there thinking, I'm going to be sitting here with David Levy when he discovers his 24th comet, and you looked at it and finally decided it wasn't, and went on down the road. But that was still quite a memory you gave me for setting out there. And it happened because you were out there with your Explorer Scientific 12-inch Dob, I think it is.
Yeah,
And
12-inch.
12-inch Dob named Eureka. And there was 6 or 8 of us out there observing, and everybody else got tired and went to bed. And, we're out in this Arizona desert, and there's wild hogs and mountain lions, and I'm tired. I've been up all day.
Polar bears, and they all wanted to look through the telescope.
And they all want to look at the telescope.
I know.
And I'm tired, but I'm observing with David Levy, and I'm thinking, David was like, go on to bed. I'm like, I'm not going to bed and be the last person that didn't save David Levy's life from a wild javelina. So I got to stay up all night with an observing session with David, and great fun. And we had a great time looking, a beautiful night, stayed out all night, watched the sunrise, saw dozens and dozens of satellites, but right before sunrise. It was running east, north, and south. It was a spectacular evening. Now, back to the library. We're going to loop back to the beginning where we started talking. When you say they have all your observing logs, exactly what does that mean?
I have been keeping, thanks for asking that. I have been keeping observing logs since 1959.
From day one?
Day one, not quite day one, but session number 1 was a partial eclipse of the sun, October the 2nd, 1959. My first observing session was at Twin Lake Camp when I was walking up to our cabin after the July 4th celebration. I looked up at the night sky. I just happened to, and I saw a shooting star. It wasn't a bright shooting star, but it was a shooting star. And I was alarmed, and I looked at the others. I said, did any of you see that shooting star just now? I said, no. And I thought to myself, little 8-year-old self, was that shooting star meant just for me? So a few months later, I thought, I did have some sessions before that. I'm going to letter them A, B, C. Those are 3 sessions before. Anyway, that was my first observing log. And I think right now I am on log 26, something like that.
So what do you put in your observing logs? I mean, just write down what you looked at?
Session number. Towards the time it ends. Space, telescopes that I've used, people that were with me, and then finally what I, and so that goes in. And the observing session that I had this morning, I think I don't have the book with me, so I can't give you the exact number, but it is well over 24,000 observing sessions.
I'm surprised it's that low, as long as you've been doing it, knowing that you live in place now where you can do it every night
I do it
effectively.
every night.
I know you do it every night.
Yeah.
And you're not an early riser because of that.
No,
Yeah, and you know,
here.
even here, you got to, because that's your schedule. Your life is that dark
My life
period.
is clear nights, I'm not observing. And cloudier nights, I'm either watching Star Trek, or watching a movie of some sort, enjoying myself. And
You carry a telescope with you everywhere you go.
I have a telescope.
You have a Questar,
I have a Questar with me.
a 4-inch,
It's a 3.5 inch.
3.5-inch Questar, beautiful telescope. At NEAF, I got to observe with it. We looked at the moon with a couple of people that were there at the hotel.
The story of Cupid, if you don't mind me telling.
Go ahead. I like this story.
Is that Wendy and I were on a kind of a post-honeymoon trip in London, England, and we walked by a telescope store. And I stopped, and she stopped, of course, because you don't go by a telescope store and not stop. And I stopped by the Questar exhibit, the old Questar. And Wendy was looking at it closely, and she knew that I had a Levy ETX at home. And she knew what the cost of the ETX was. It was about $700. And she saw the price tag of the Questar, which was approximately $7,000. And she said, David, I need for you to give me an honest answer. Is this Questar 10 times better than the ETX? I said, that's an easy question to answer. I said, this Questar is better than the ETX, but it ain't 10 times better. It's nowhere near 10 times better. In fact, at low power, it's about the same. At high power, it's a little better than the ETX. And Wendy looked at me and she said, thank you for saying that. As soon as we got home from that trip, unbeknownst to me, she got in touch with Dean from Arizona. And she said, I want to get David a Questar as a wedding present. Dean took out a dealership so he could get the Questar. And one night he said, let's take you guys to dinner. So we dropped what we were doing, went to this dinner where there's this beautiful package on the table with a bow on top of it. And the telescope was in there. I brought it with me at this meeting.
Yeah.
And I just love that telescope.
Beautiful work of art.
It's a work of art and it has a personality. It's a little lonely that it stays away from all the other telescopes. But I do say hi to it and I pet it sometimes.
And you give it some eyeball love.
I give it eyeball love.
So what did you look at last night?
Last night I didn't have the test out of the binoculars out, but I can answer that question. I've been looking at toward the constellation of Corona Borealis.
Mm-hmm. I wonder why.
Well, the answer to that question,
You think?
you know the answer.
Yes, I do.
Is that there is a recurrent nova in Corona Borealis. It was called T Corona Borealis. In 1866, That star rose from 10th magnitude to second
So-
in a few hours.
So it went from not naked eye visible to naked eye visible
Yeah.
in a matter of
Hours.
hours.
And
Brightness of Polaris, roughly, something like that.
then 1946, it did the same thing again.
Let's see, what year was that? The first year?
The first year is 1866.
1866, then,
80 years later.
and now,
1946.
and now we are 80 years. Yeah,
But there is other evidence that the star is imminently
That's
going to be going into
sometime between now and October is what they're saying, right?
for this
Yeah.
year. And not because so much of the 80 years, but because of the behavior that the star went through before the 1946 hours. It has completed that same behavior. Now, a little bit brighter and quite a bit fainter.
So it's a red giant being orbited closely by another star, right?
Yeah.
And
Dwarf star.
by a dwarf star, and the red giant is pulling matter off of the dwarf star,
Mhm.
in which when it reaches supernova or nova mass, it
Which is-
explodes
which is
and blows
very
off all
important.
that mass,
Yeah.
and then
It's very
and
bright.
goes back to doing its
Yeah.
78 or 80-year cycle again.
Yeah.
And that's the difference between a nova and a supernova. A supernova is when the star blows up and is gone.
Yeah, much the same, it can't be much the same process, except so much material gets together. The whole star.
Right. So this doesn't happen. The whole star didn't blow up. It just blows off all the matter it's accreted. It has a temper tantrum like a 2-year-old.
And anyway, reading Starlight Nights, which is my favorite book, and I've written 40 books in my lifetime, and I would dearly like to sell them to you.
It doesn't matter which one.
But if
Just one.
But if you ask me what my favorite book is, it's none of those. My favorite book in the universe, it's none of those, and it's not Shakespeare, although Shakespeare's up there. It is Starlight Nights, The Adventures of a Stargazer by Leslie Peltier.
Can you give us, I know you can give us a quote.
Well, I'll give you an exact quote. But first of all, that I want to describe his observation of T Corona Borealis in 1946. Where was I? I was asleep. And he says, I woke up that morning in February 1946. And I got up and I was walking toward the window and I thought, when I looked out the window, I saw the clear sky. But then I sneezed and I really wasn't feeling that good. And I thought, I think I'm coming down with a cold, or maybe even worse than a cold. I'm going back to bed. And he said, and that is how I missed the night of nights in the life of T Corona Borealis. The night that T Corona Borealis took off its covers off of its bed and rose. And where was I? I was asleep. And he finally ends it by saying, I still look at T Corona Borealis every night, but it is with a watchful eye. There is no warmth between us anymore. And I read that, and it's holy. The writing is holy. It's biblical. I mean, the fact that he could take a star and describe a personal friendship with a star is holy to me. And he also mentions how he his telescopes with people. And what he said is, it's the mountain and the squirrel. And the mountain says, I can have forests on my back. And the squirrel says, maybe you do have forests on your back, but you can't crack a nut. And the two telescopes that Leslie had, the 12-inch and the 6, would have the same conversation. 16th magnitude variable stars. And the little one says, yes, but you can't catch a comet like I can.
Very good, David. All right, you can go on for hours and I can ask you questions, excuse me, for hours. Let's wrap this up with that idea that what we do and look up at the stars
Okay,
is
I'm
a
going
touch
to-
of holy.
A touch of holy, and I'm going to quote Time has not lessened the age-old allure of the comets. In some ways, their mystery has only deepened with the years. At each return, a comet brings with it the questions that were asked when it was here before. As it rounds the sun and backs away toward the long, slow night of its aphelion, it leaves behind those questions still unanswered. To hunt a speck of moving haze may seem a strange pursuit, but even though we fail, the search is still rewarding. For in no better way can we come face to face, night after night, with such a wealth of riches as old Croesus never dreamed of.
Thank you, David, very much for,
Thank you, Keith.
for gracing us with your stories.
I
Truly
want-
magnificent.
I want you to know that thank you.
This is, love it, love it. And I know the people that are watching feel the how this is truly part of your being, is the night sky. And you know, I can keep, okay, so you told me this story, I've got to say it. Tell the story about what your father said to you that you were telling me over lunch.
I'm going to tell you this. Right after I really fell in love with the night sky, and also I would talk about.
You're how old at this point?
12.
12.
I'm 12. And I'm talking about the sky, and my brother and my sisters. My sister and my brothers are kind of sort of patiently listening or running away or whatever. And Dad says, David, we're begging you to do us a favor. Last week, all we talked about was astronomy. Next week, we're going to talk about astronomy. This week, we're going to do something else. And he says, David, please don't make astronomy the most important thing in your life. I want you to have a childhood like everybody else does. And I turned around and I said, okay, I won't. And then I said to myself, I'll make it the only thing in my life.
And it is your life.
And it is my life.
Yeah.
And years later, my dad, who was getting Alzheimer's disease, which meant that he couldn't remember what happened 10 minutes ago, but he never forgot that advice he gave me when I was 12. And he said, do you remember what I told you when you were 12? I said, yeah. And he said, I was so wrong. And I said, no, you were not wrong. I was one-tracked. I still am one-tracked. And he said, the reason I was wrong was that I had no idea what you were going to do with that passion. If I had had any inkling what you were going to do with it, there's no way I would have told you to stop. I would have been encouraging you. And he did encourage me. He encouraged me by telling me about his favorite book as a child. It was a book called Cole of Spyglass Mountain. And it was about a young boy named Joshua Cole, who was beaten by his parents and finally sent away to boarding school, where he learns about astronomy. He becomes an astronomer. He inherits a lot of money and builds himself an observatory on Spyglass Mountain, it's called. And on one night, he discovers life on Mars, most important discovery in all time, that there's intelligent life on another planet. And he, at the same instant he makes the discovery, people anxious to take his wealth from him try to shoot him. And they hit him, but they don't kill him. And he's sitting there recovering from his injuries. And people come running in with the press saying, amateur astronomer discovers evidence of life on Mars. Discovery confirmed. On the end of that book, Dad was just grinning from ear to ear when he said, first to report discovery, Cole of Spyglass Mountain, famous in a night. And he's never forgotten that, and neither have I.
That's awesome.
The telescope that I've been using, because one of the telescopes that I love is being maintained right now, undergoing maintenance. So I have another telescope that Dean gave me, and I call it Cole after the novel. And the other night I used it to do some comet hunting, and I didn't come across a new comet, but I did come across Comet Olbers.
Mhm.
It is a Halley-type comet, comes by every 59 years or something like that. And it was my second view of it, this particular apparition. But my first view through Cole of Spyglass Mountain.
That's awesome. All right, Scott, any questions over there?
Well, no questions, but Jim Browder watching on YouTube says, thanks, David and Kent, for a fascinating discussion. So
Who was that? Jim who?
Jim Browder.
Jim Browder said, thank you, David and Kent, for the fascinating discussion. David can't hear this. I can barely hear it. What else you got,
Okay.
Scott? Anything else?
Well, thank you.
That's it. That's it for right
Okay.
now. So,
All right. So we'll have somebody else on here in a little while.
okay.
I want to thank you, David, for gracing us with a few moments of your precious time.
Yeah, thanks.
He is a sought after.
Biden during that interview?
No, you did not. You did not.
I thought I got a couple.
No, you did fine. You know, and everybody here loves David. And he is so gracious with his time
And
and
over
so
here
humble,
too.
so humble about, you know, his life, and he's an open book, and it's inspirational to see how his approach to life.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to sign off. David Levy, Kent Martz. Back in the studio, if we want to call it that, is Scott Roberts. Scott, thanks for setting all this up so we can do this. It's enjoyable.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. So we will we'll resume back with Kent Martz as he gets more speakers and presenters for the 2024 Astronomical League Convention in Kansas City, Kansas. So until then, we will see you, and keep looking up.